we have a really fascinating afternoon in store for you. Our advisory board, when we met at the Emirates Academy last year, they said, let's bring in speakers that are from outside the industry, which is always a challenge, and it's always fun to do that. So we've got some great speakers here this afternoon, the likes of my friend Khosro here, who's speaking on the world's first vegan ice cream, which is where the planet needs to go. We need to be looking at these sort of food products. But to introduce all our panelists this afternoon and keep us on time, I'm delighted that we've got Dr. Martin Berlin, who's head of the real estate practice at PwC. Martin has been a great supporter of ours over the years. And what I love about Martin is that he's always looking to do things slightly differently. He says, Jonathan, can I speak on something that's disruptive? Can I speak on new trends that are taking place in the industry? And so we recently had him at the Saudi Hotel Investment Conference in Riyadh, and he spoke about cinemas and what cinemas are doing in that market, which he's also an expert in. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin Berlin.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Thank you, and very welcome to the afternoon of day one, the day of disruption, which I'm not going to give a speech this time. I just lead you through the program. It's actually my 5th time with AHIC, and today I will take you on a journey on technology, be it blockchain, AR, AI, VR, whatever you call it, and how these technologies are impacting the hospitality industry. But we start with Dr. Khosro, who is going to give us a view on actually the center of hospitality, the guest, the customer, and what and how to identify the truly white space for the customer going forward into the future. Please welcome together with me Dr. Khosro. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My talk is a little bit difficult, actually, to give because it's more an experiential thing. So I'd like to start, actually, with a question to you. I have a hard time seeing people, but I'll trust you follow this along. I'm not going to ask you what is the most happy or sad memory you have in your life. Generally, the answer to both questions is when I got married. But if you think about the most intense experience you had, the most fulfilling experience you had in your life, and I'll give you 30 seconds of my talk just to kind of reflect on it. Have most of you identified something? Just show me by show of hands whether you have. Okay. Some of you haven't. You still have a few seconds. What is the characteristic of that experience? Generally, what I hear is that something that has been very, very intense, it's some experience where you're very much in touch with yourself. You're real. You're in the moment, as some people put it. You're in the flow, as other people put it. So there's some place where you're connecting to your inner needs, your inner self, your inner realities, your inner truths. The other side of it is, which happens almost at the same time, is that you tend to be connected to the world. You tend to be connected to others. I'm sure most of your intense experiences that you just thought about involves others. Let me park that for a second. I'll return to that. But just what I just said, with how many people did it resonate? I know it's after lunch, but just lift your arms if it did resonate with you. Okay, so quite a few of you. Those with whom it didn't resonate, I'd love to hear from you afterwards. So let me tell you a little bit about my background. I've started a whole bunch of companies. I've tried to arrange them in ecosystem. On the left-hand side is a consultancy on innovation where we mainly do what I'm going to talk about today, which I call nascent demand. We then look at the execution of that insight, and then we also look at the types of industries where we feel that insight has a relevance, which is mostly consumer-focused industries, so certainly your industry. The impact we try to achieve is either shortening the innovation times, having more relevance for that innovations, meaning more sales or more profitability, or just refining also existing value propositions. On the right-hand side is Zendegi, which is a company that actually tries to go and do it, take the insights and help both other companies in the food and beverage mostly area, as well as its own brands to deliver completely new, novel value propositions. Jonathan referred to our little pride and joy there, the bear, which is Frill. It's the world's first vegan ice cream. It's made with fruit and vegetable. Those of you who listen to the tea talk, very much the same mindset there. How can we create something that's actually truly healthy, which means fat and sugar has to go out. We just launched it actually on NASDAQ First North, so we're very, very proud of that brand. But then another is like Arakari, which is a from ground up, built up red wine substitute. So certainly for markets around here, highly relevant. And we invest in companies that we find exciting, Protein Pow being one of them. Why is what I'm talking about relevant? I may not have the right solution for it, that's up for you to decide, but ultimately if you look at innovations, particularly in the consumer-facing industries, in the IT, sort of the app space, which is also consumer-focused, retail, something like 5%, if you're lucky, of innovations actually make it big. Whichever way you want to measure it. If you want to measure it, if you're a venture capital company, about 5% of them make it big. If you're a global beverage company, about 5% of your launches make it past 50 million, and you're looking for $1 billion brand. So basically nothing. So all that big red effort there delivers a rather small output. And the question is, how do we actually make a difference in that? Most innovators are actually plagiarists and sort of incrementalists. So you need to think a little bit in a more sort of crazy way, and hopefully the rest of the talk will give you some ideas. So what happens when you're asked a question? And the reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of people try to gain insight into what the consumer wants by asking them questions. The problem is when you ask a question, it first of all goes to the wrong side of the brain. Goes to this side. So there you recognize the question asked to you. There are shortcuts in your brain that you sort of try to answer, and you immediately link it to your own biases. And you try not to violate those biases when you're answering it. But it's ultimately a brain-based, it's an intellectual game that you're playing. However, there's the other side of your brain, the sort of more creative side, which is driven by a whole bunch of things. Science has not yet even come close to understanding it. It's linked to sort of pictures you have, your senses, how you feel at that moment in terms of your body and gut feel, fantasies you have, creativity, just name it. And then there's hidden external influencers. Could be others who you're linked to, could be just emergence of things that just are serendipitous. It's very, very hard to gain a guess as to what those things are. So focus groups tend to play in this space. They try to play here, they might show you pictures and get you sort of to pick what might fit. But ultimately, it's something where it's driven off of already a pre-thinking. It's driven off of a hypothesis that whoever has the question is asking you. But what you're trying to do is you want to understand the consumer in new ways, and you want to see what do they have up their sleeve. So what are authentic reactions that they have to potential solutions that you're giving them. So we looked at that space, and if you look at what's available, there's a lot of snapshotty things. Let me take a snapshot of the consumer. So focus groups is a good example of that. I can do that at a qualitative level. I can do it at a quantitative level. So I can sort of do, let's say, visual tracking of the consumer in a store and just see what are they actually looking at. But these are all snapshots. They're not developmental. They don't show an evolution of the consumer along any dimension. When you then look at the developmental side, at the quantitative level, there's some stuff. There's trend research where you're trying to sort of come up with where are things going. You look at certain communities that are trendsetters, and you want to sort of see what are they doing, and then maybe follow suit. So there's some solutions there. But at the qualitative individual level, there is very little. And the second thing is, it's very, very hard to see what they have up their sleeves, the consumers. They may, in a normal interaction with you, give you one answer because they're very good at reading what you want to hear, but they may behave very differently. So some companies solve it by actually having reality presented to the consumer. They have pop-ups where they're selling a product and trying to see if the consumer actually will buy it. So those are ways of trying to get to that. So the methodology that we've developed tries to come at this from a new way. So what's the perfect way of figuring out what the consumer wants? It's represented by this rather crazy-looking bird there. So an ideal tool would be non-biased, meaning if I'm presenting it to the consumer, my biases are completely taken out of that. But it should be highly biased on the side of the consumer. The consumer needs to care about that question. We want the consumer to be co-creators. We want their intelligence to feed into that. We want to have very tangible outputs. Remember, trend research, which I showed there as something that has a dynamic aspect to it, I find often the results are too high level to know exactly what to do with that. So if somebody says millennials like spicy food, well, which spice, in what food, how, in what segment, what do I do actually with that information? Or if somebody says Generation Z is fluidity, they're all about fluidity, I'm not quite sure how can I translate that into a toothbrush or into a hotel room. Next point is around granularity of the features. So something that actually allows me, once I built it in, to know whether I'm succeeding or not succeeding. And remember, this methodology would be individual, qualitative, so you need to pair it with something where you can actually have statistical relevance to it in order to be sure that actually it works ultimately in the market. So what I call this is a bit deep data complementing big data, which is the other source of a lot of good insight. So this is the way you would normally set it up if you're a logical human being. You would say, well, let me define the target and recruit. Let me generate a set of visuals, themes, prototypes, something that I share with the consumer. Then I check the ideas with the consumer by exposing them to questions and whatever else there is. I interview them about their dislikes and likes. I consolidated my findings, and I'm amazed that the consumer generally confirms what I initially thought is the case. And when I talk to big consumer groups companies, they all shake their heads when I say this. These two topics are right, but these actually prevent you from getting to real answers. And you have to turn this on its head. This is what we do. You still define the segment and target because you need to know who you're talking to, but then you actually create the prototypes that explicitly contain hypotheses that you have around what the consumer wants, but you do not show them the prototypes yet. Then what you do is you trigger sensory pathways around the product. A little bit similar to what the question I asked you, just more specific around your sense, because we perceive the world through our senses, and we have more than 5 senses. Then you trigger self-development pathways, meaning the question I asked you earlier, it triggers a self-development pathway because you're harking back to something that is meaningful to you. If I would continue that conversation with you, your whole being, your whole subconscious starts engaging in a very, very different way with me than if I asked you what time it is. You explore those intensity signals because as the consumer is engaging with this, because it's deeply important to them, because it's deeply linked to their personal development, the answers that they give you are much more meaningful and much more passionately felt by that consumer at that moment. And at point of highest intensities, only then do you show them the prototypes. Only then do you give them sort of your views or your ideas or the solutions that you've come up with. Often we find that we realize, whoops, our prototypes have nothing to do with what the consumer actually deeply cares about, and they will actually be brutal about it. Sometimes they tweak it, sometimes they combine it. And then you analyze it and put it into the next generation. Most importantly, though, you do two things. Often, consumers come up with something, and you need to go make sure that some version of that maybe already exists in the market. The market subconsciously has already solved it. I'll give you an example in a second. But then you also do a preference test so that you know that statistically the whole thing makes sense. So here are some of the outputs. You can get triggers for consumption. You get the entry points. How does the consumer enter in their interaction with a product? So for example, a hotel room. What is actually the initial engagement that the consumer has with a hotel room? I have no idea what the answer is, but is it turning on the TV or is it actually the handle of the door? I don't know. But you need to understand that because that's the place where you're engaging consumer primarily. There's a journey of the sensations, the choice drivers that they have, the solution spaces that they come up with for you. Emotionally charged words, these are really, really important because when you market to the consumer, you want to know what is negative, what is positive in terms of specific words, but also thematic topics. What are themes that the consumer links to the product or service? And then finally, the response to the prototypes. Very quickly, some examples. Some of it has been redacted because it's considered obviously competitively relevant. But here's an example of a red wine, which we actually used to develop the alcohol-free red wine. The question is, why do consumers drink a red wine? And the answer is not obvious, actually. First of all, most people immediately, if I asked you intellectually, people would say, well, duh, it's the alcohol. The answer is no, duh, it's not the alcohol whatsoever. The alcohol does something, which is it heats the throat when it goes down the throat. That's what it does. It's not the intoxicating effect that alcohol has. And that's when the consumer changes their mood from whatever they are to a relaxed mood. So you need to understand that. So if you want to create alcohol-free wine, what most people do is they de-alcoholize a wine, you have just lost the most important trigger. So we'd add some chili into the wine and a few other things to actually give you that heat, to allow you to change the mood. There's one other sort of anecdote to pull out of there. When you ask them what's the perfect wine, 90% of the people we interview will say, you know, the perfect wine has this velvetiness. And they go like this when they talk about velvetiness. And you ask them to describe it, and they surprise themselves. They're going like, well, I don't know, it's sort of velvety like velvet. So we tested it out. We put velvet on bottles, and consumers go crazy. That's actually what they want. It's so easy to say they mean velvety feel in the mouth, some kind of a mouth feel, but it's not the case. So what we then did was we just analyzed the market for wines, and guess what? The roughness of the paper correlates to the price of the bottle. So the market sort of has solved this. It's just that the consumer wants velvet. They don't want rough paper. You get sort of whole spaces around what a particular product or service has a feel. And this is very, very important also for your industry. Understanding what feel the consumer wants to have is quite important for the product or service. You have the sensory entrance. So is it sort of haptic, or is it, do you smell it, or is it more of an intellectual product? And then you want to sort of take the findings that you've had and see who else in the market is actually solving all of your findings. And then guess what? There are these three important findings. This was done for a big beverage company. These three findings, nobody else had solved. And so then the obvious thing was that's where we're going to differentiate ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have sufficient time for questions. Questions from the stage, from the audience, I mean. Any questions? There's one over there, please. Mike? Can we get a mic? It's coming.
So, question about the type of market. Hotels primarily are B2B in terms of their sales. We often forget that in terms of most people staying in hotels, certainly where you're making the money is in business travelers. How much does that impact what you're talking about here in that B2B environment compared to the B2C environment?
I'm not in your segment, so take whatever I'm saying with a grain of salt. I would say there's still a consumer at the other end who makes decisions around it, unless their company has said, you only go to this hotel and so on and so forth. But even those consumers have an influence on their company, because they will say, we don't like this place, or we like this other thing. So I would say, as long as there's a true consumer there, if you're selling, a widget to a big company that just makes something else out of it, that's true B2B. I would say here, it's still, I would consider it B2C, and the opinions and the desires of those consumers, if you want to differentiate and if you get it right, then maybe with the added part of what the sort of company behind them also needs you to do for them. But ultimately, I think it's the individual who chooses you and forces their company to choose you. I don't think it's entirely driven off of cost per bed. I don't know if that resonates, but again, I'm naive as far as your industry is concerned.
Other questions? We have time for one other question.
Back there.
Down there.
Hello. So I have a quick question. When you were testing the hypothesis model that you discussed, so scientifically speaking, we follow the hypothesis testing, then it's either falsified or it ends up being true.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the prototype. So you ask questions, you work on them, you have the prototype, you show them to your customers. Most of the time they say yes. It turns out this is not what they want. So you proposed a better model. How does this play in the hospitality industry? So you're technically asking them questions, and you're saying at the peak of their emotional, genuinity or sincerity, then you know what they want. But how do you actually do that? It's very nice theoretically speaking, but practically, how can you reach that position with your customers so that you know that you can tailor the experience to what they really want?
Yeah, it takes a bit longer sort of discussion to answer that properly. You need to define the segment, and then you need to ask what question do you want to have answered. So for example, you may want to ask the question, what's the perfect room? Or from this morning where I participated, what's the perfect engagement around breakfast? What is that? However, you don't let them just answer you intellectually. What you're then doing is you're looking at intensity signals, and that conversation will go often off topic. We did this work for this one car company that wanted to know, what do people want in the car? And I'll vividly remember this one discussion with somebody who kept talking about the metro and how, he hates the metro and so on and so on. And in this methodology, we follow where they go, where their intensity goes. And 20 minutes later, that individual found the circle back, because what they like, despite hating the metro, what they like about the metro is that it doesn't waste their time. They can read a book. And so then it comes back to the types of solutions you might give that consumer, and then, of course, you need to have statistical relevance. So the thing is that when you follow the intensity path of the person, and this is derived off of a psychological method where an individual will develop within an hour the next step in their lives. So basically, you're taking them exactly on that journey. The answers that they give you come from a very different angle. They surface things that are not conscious to the consumer. Often consumers at the end of a session say, somehow this was deeply meaningful to me. Well, guess what? Because they have gone on a personal development path. It's just that we've paid them money to do it, and we're not responsible for them to actually have taken the next step in their lives. But that's where you want to hook into. So the question that you would normally ask, it's still the same question. It's just the pathway you take is not bombarding them with the next intellectual question and answer. Now, all of you who didn't raise your hands earlier, please come and find me. I'd love to know what those thoughts you had about meaningful experiences. Maybe I learned something from you too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Khosro.